All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are heading deep into the Amazon. Well, metaphorically, of course, to talk about COP30. This is a huge climate summit, and it really boils down to one massive goal: to finally turn years and years of promises into actual, real, measurable action. So yeah, let's dive right in.
So why is this particular summit so critical? Well, to get it, we really need to rewind a bit. About a decade, actually. Back to a promise that honestly is looking pretty fragile right now.
It's been about a decade since the world signed the Paris Agreement. And that was a huge deal, right? A real landmark moment of global unity. But, and this is a big but, since then, the gap between what we all promised to do and what we've actually done, it hasn't just widened. Honestly, it's become a massive chasm.
And this right here, this really gets to the heart of the problem. You've got the promise on one side, that clear, science-backed goal to keep warming well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5. And then you have the reality on the other side. Emissions are still going up, and the impacts of climate change are getting more and more intense. It's a classic case of our ambition just not lining up with our actions.
So, the big question is, how do we fix this? Well, the world's answer, or at least its attempt at an answer, is to gather in a place that is, let's just say, deeply symbolic. The hope is that the location itself will help force a change.
Yeah, choosing Belém, Brazil, that was absolutely not an accident. This city is literally the gateway to the Amazon rainforest. That vital, incredible ecosystem that holds something like 200 billion tons of carbon. And it's an ecosystem that's teetering on the brink of irreversible decline. So, holding the summit here, it's a very deliberate, very powerful choice. It's meant to put the crisis right on the world's doorstep, where no one can ignore it.
And that's exactly why you'll hear people calling this the implementation COP. That's its nickname. The big hope is that this will finally be a watershed moment, a point where all those years of, kind of vague commitments finally get translated into concrete, real-world action plans for everything: energy, transportation, our food systems, the forests, the whole shebang. So the key tool they're going to use for this is something called the Global Stocktake, or GST. The easiest way to think about it is like a mandatory global report card. Seriously, every 5 years, countries have to get together, assess their progress, be honest about where they're falling short, and then draft even stronger plans. It's basically the built-in accountability engine of the entire Paris Agreement.
Okay, but plans and accountability, they're pretty meaningless without resources, right? And that, of course, brings us to the biggest, toughest hurdle in pretty much every single climate negotiation: money. For years, there was this magic number floating around: $100 billion. That was the annual pledge from developed countries to help developing nations deal with climate change. It was supposed to be a cornerstone of trust in this whole process. But it was a promise that was pretty much consistently broken.
So, negotiators finally had to admit that the $100 billion target was, well, first, not being met, and second, not even enough to begin with. So they created a new framework. It's called the New Collective Quantified Goal, or NCQG for short. And this is the brand new, much, much larger finance target that's supposed to be finalized in Belém.
So what's the new number? Well, take a look. The new baseline is expected to triple the old one. We're talking about a target of at least $300 billion annually by the year 2035.
But here's the kicker. Even that massive number, it's just a starting point. The real amount that's needed, when you count all sources, public money, private investment, everything, is estimated to be over $1.3 trillion a year. So that $300 billion target, that's just the public finance piece of a much, much bigger, more complicated puzzle.
And this naturally brings us to what is probably the most contentious question in this entire negotiation. Who pays for it all? Who is responsible for coming up with this finance? I mean, this is the question that will pretty much define whether the talks in Belém are a success or a failure. Really, the whole debate boils down to these two words: all actors. See, the new goal is designed to mobilize money from every possible source you can think of: public treasuries, big development banks, private investors, philanthropies, you name it. But for a lot of developing nations, this language feels like a loophole. They see it as a way to dilute the historical responsibility of the developed countries, the ones who contributed the most to the climate crisis to begin with.
And it's so important to remember that this money isn't just for cutting emissions. A massive chunk of it is desperately, desperately needed to help communities adapt to the climate change that's not some far-off threat. It's already here, and it's getting worse.
Now, this part of the conversation,
It's been a really difficult, long-delayed piece of the puzzle. So a huge focus at COP30 is going to be finally establishing something called the Global Goal on Adaptation. Think of it as a framework that's meant to help all of us prepare for the impacts that we just can't avoid anymore.
The whole idea here is to take adaptation from being this kind of abstract concept and turn it into a concrete plan. What does that mean? It means setting actual quantifiable targets for resilience. It means organizing the funding to match those needs. And really crucially, it means integrating all that local and indigenous knowledge from communities that have been building resilience for centuries.
But look, a successful transition, it can't just be fueled by money. It also has to be fair. It has to be just.
And what we mean by that is, we have to make sure the new green economy doesn't just repeat all the old inequalities of the fossil fuel economy. So that means guaranteeing that developing countries have access to technology, it means fostering real, genuine collaboration for innovation, and it means investing in the green skills that are going to power the jobs of the future.
So, let's bring it all together. As the whole world turns its eyes to the Amazon, what is truly at stake here at COP30?
Well, to put it as simply as possible, the stakes could not be any higher. This isn't just about climate targets or the planet in an abstract sense. This is a test of whether global cooperation on this massive scale is even possible anymore. I mean, pretty much everything is on the line here. We're talking about the fate of vital ecosystems like the Amazon itself. We're talking about the credibility of this entire global climate action process. And maybe, just maybe, it's our last best chance to finally bend the curve of global emissions downwards. Success? Well, success puts us on a path to a livable future. But failure? Failure risks locking in damage that we can never, ever reverse.
So ultimately, the whole world is going to be watching Belém, and everyone will be asking one simple, crucial question. Is this the moment? Is this when we finally match our actions to our words? Or is this going to be just another broken promise? Thank you for watching.